Welcome to the Writing Westward podcast. I'm your host, Brenden Rensink. Today we will explore early Western literature and the unknown history of women authors in the developments of the genre. Our guest, Professor Victoria Lamont, is the author of Westerns, A Women's History. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. In each episode of this podcast, we host a conversation with an author or scholar of new work that explores the North American West. Disciplines will vary, the length of conversations will likely range dramatically, but we hope that each conversation will introduce you to new work, provoke as many questions as they provide answers, and inspire you to learn more about the North American West as a region, as well as its peoples, environments, histories, literature, and so forth. To learn more about the Redd Center, our programming, funding opportunities for research and events, find us at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's reddcenter.byu.edu. Follow Writing Westward on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast or on Twitter at Writing West. You can find a list of podcast episodes and listen on the Redd Center website and clicking on the Writing Westward Podcast tab at the top of the page. You can also listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and various other podcast networks and distributors. Thanks for listening. The prevailing story of how Western novels developed into a serious genre of literature begins with Owen Wister's 1902 novel, The Virginian. From there on out, much of the field of Western literature has been quite gendered and divided, with male authors like Wister, Zane Grey, or Louis L'Amour writing the serious Western fiction, and female authors writing primarily Western romance. Victoria Lamont, an associate professor of English at the University of Waterloo, upends this gendered telling of how the Western novel came to be. Her book, Westerns, A Women's History, was published by the University of Nebraska Press in 2016, and it reveals a very different story. Some 12 years before Wister published The Virginian, a woman named Emma Gent Curtis published a Western novel that featured some of the exact types of Western characters that Owen Wister is often credited with establishing as stock characters for the genre. In our conversation with Lamont, we explore this and some other early works by female Western novelists. We discuss the publishing and reading world they inhabited, and we explore how the stories these women told were both similar to and distinct from the more well-known texts. Professor Victoria Lamont, welcome to our program, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I spent some time with your book a few days ago. As I was explaining, as is my habit, I take a hammock up into the mountains and I sway in the breeze and read and take notes. And it took me a lot longer to get through than I thought it would because I kept on rereading passages and it was just absolutely fascinating. A great book.
Oh, thank you so much.
Can I ask, how did you come to this topic?
I started working on this way back in graduate school when I was working on a master's at the University of Guelph with Christine Bold, whose work you might be familiar with.
We just had her here on campus a couple months ago.
And I took a course from her called Women in the West. I learned about, in that course, I learned about a woman called B.M. Bauer, and she just fascinated me. She was a prolific author of popular Westerns, and it just was a contradiction in terms. Everything I had thought about popular Westerns associated them with men and male writers and male readers. And yet here was this woman writer who was a household name when she was writing. And I just investigated more and I found more and more writers, and I was really fascinated with their work, and it all just grew from there.
Well, this is something I thought we might get to towards the end, but we might as well do it now. Can you define what you call a quality Western? How does that differ from other forms of early Western literature? What is a quality Western novel?
It should be clear that I don't mean that to say that they're any better than any other Western. It's a historical category. It has to do with, it comes from the way that publishers themselves thought about what they were doing. And so some publishers were careful to differentiate themselves from mass-produced fiction. So the term that they would use would be the quality press, or we're quality publishers.
So this is real literature. It's not dime novel,
Yeah,
kind of lower
exactly.
brow.
Yeah, so that's how it's not necessarily a kind of judgment on the value of those works aesthetically.
Well, so the reason I wanted to get this definition, or kind of in our minds, is because you explained that in years later, the narrative of how the quality Western, or kind of this more kind of proper Western novel, starts as a genre
Hmm.
is one of male writers. And in I think maybe actually be the last chapter of your book, you explain how women become more
Hmm.
associated with Western romance novels, but that's all a development that comes much later than the period that you're talking about throughout your book. Can you kind of explain how the Western novel becomes a masculinized genre?
Right. So the kind of conventional, or the maybe more familiar history of the Western as we know it, starts with Owen Wister's The Virginian. And the kind of narrative I inherited when I first came into this subject was that Owen Wister kind of saves the Western, or makes it respectable again after it had been taken over by dime novels.
Yeah.
And then from there, you have other Western writers like Zane Grey and Max Brand and Louis L'Amour who basically imitate Owen Wister. But I kind of looked in my research more closely at that moment when The Virginian is published. And there's no arguing that The Virginian was an important book, and it attracted a lot of attention.
It was a bestseller in ways that Western
Yeah,
novels hadn't done
yeah.
before, right?
And it was published by a so-called quality publisher, Macmillan. So
Hmm.
it,
Yeah.
it wasn't just another dime novel. But if you look really closely at that very early moment, you see quite, and even before that moment, you see a lot of women writers who are also writing what you could characterize as Westerns.
So why then did we inherit? Because this is the narrative I inherited as well.
Yeah,
It's also the narrative I've taught.
sure,
So
okay.
which in the next version of my lectures, I'll be revising all of this.
Oh, good.
So
I'm glad.
why did that become the narrative we inherited? How did those women get written out of the narrative? Those early female authors.
Well, they're publishing. Those first women are publishing in the very early pulp magazines. This is before pulp magazines, between about the early 1900s and World War I. And they looked a lot different than the later pulp magazines that are maybe now familiar to us looked. So these were general fiction magazines, and they really tried to imitate the so-called quality or slick magazines. And part of imitating those magazines and kind of claiming to be respectable was to appeal to women readers. To produce quality fiction, your fiction had to be suitable to sort of be left on the table in the parlor for the women of the house and maybe the kids to come across. And that was part of respectability at that time. And so that's where we see the Western first becoming popularized. And a lot of the writers who are popularizing the Western in these early pulps are women, particularly Bertha Muzzy Bauer was extremely, extremely prolific. And she was actually the first author to popularize the Western after Owen Wister.
Hmm.
But then, and so these early pulp magazines aren't publishing the genres that we now identify with the pulp. They're instead publishing kind of wide range of different types of stories to appeal to a wide range of readers. And they're not necessarily differentiating between stories for women and stories for men. They're just stories. When B.M. Bauer started writing, she was writing Western stories, not Westerns. The term Western hadn't yet been coined. but then what starts to happen, particularly after World War I, is that pulp publishers start to experiment with marketing practices and niche readerships. And so they look at the stories that they're offering, and they start to break them down into the genres that are familiar to us today. And one of the things they notice is that their westerns that they're publishing can be broken down, they think, into two different types of westerns. One that is male-oriented, that is more adventure-based, and one that is female-oriented and is more romance-based. And so two different Western magazines come into being during the 20s that are both appealing, starting to address different gendered readerships. So it's a kind of a marketing strategy that they start to employ. So these two genres of Western, the romance Western and the adventure Western, come into being at almost exactly the same time in the early 1920s. But then something else happens a few decades later when scholars start to pay attention to the popular Western as a subject of study, and they look back and they kind of have internalized
the marketing,
these gendered genres, these marketing categories. But the other thing that they do is they construct the Western romance as an imitation. And so they kind of almost automatically, without really thinking it through, take on that kind of binary of the male is the original and the female is the imitation. And they have internalized that. And so they don't really pay attention to the Western romance as a Western in its own right, but they treat it as this kind of feminized imitation of a masculine original.
And with that masculine original, some of these earlier female authors are kind of then written out of the story somewhat because they don't fit that narrative, do they?
No, they don't. The very early ones are not. They don't see themselves as writing Western romances. They see them as writing Western stories, the same way that Owen Wister saw himself as writing a Western story. So in the very early kind of 20th century Westerns are not really seen as writing for men. They're seen as literature. They're seen as fiction. What also happened with the narrative is that the dime novel got confused with these early Westerns. But dime novels carried over a kind of a different idea about readers of cheap fiction from the 19th century. And this idea was that readers of cheap fiction were kind of juvenile in their tastes, and so they did have more gendered tastes. Boys wanted to read boys' stuff, and girls wanted to read girls' stuff. And I think that got confused with the kinds of Westerns that were being published in this new kind of pulp that was trying to imitate the more expensive quality pulp magazines. So it's a bit of a complicated narrative.
Well, why is it then in the 60s and 70s and beyond, when there's scholars studying Western women's literature, they discover Willa Cather and others, and they really dig into them and showcase a number of female authors working in the field of Western literature.
Yeah.
But yet these Western female novelists have not enjoyed quite the rediscovery.
That's a really good question. There's more than one answer to that, or more than one part to my answer to that question. But I think, first of all, those early scholars of Western women writer, they also were working with those internalized category of the popular Western equals masculinity equals violence, violent conquest, and so on.
So as a genre, they set it aside.
Yeah, and so they looked then to more literary fiction that differentiated itself from the popular Western. And Willa Cather, was it a Pulitzer? I think she was, she was a
I think so,
prize-winning, still in print. So she was kind of an obvious place for those scholars to go in terms of recovering a women's West. But then another reason is that almost all of the writers that I talk about in my book, if not all of them, were out of print. And so they just weren't known. So that's also an important, people like Willa Cather, she never really faded out of the consciousness, the cultural consciousness in the same way that someone like B.M. Bauer did.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is kind of long preamble. Let's get to the actual, some of these case studies and these female authors you talk about in your book.
Okay.
And one of the most fascinating, so again, we have Owen Wister, who publishes The Virginian in, is it 1902?
Yeah.
But a full 12 or 13 years prior, you open your book talking about Emma Gent Curtis and her book. Now, pronounce the title of the book for me.
I don't know how she pronounced it, but I pronounce it The Administratrix.
Okay, that's close to what I was going to say as well.
Okay.
Which you present as a full, not just a kind of proper Western novel a full 12 years before Wister's The Virginian, but one that plays with very similar themes, very similar kind of character tropes. You have all those kind of stock Western novel characters. So it wasn't just that there happened to be a female author writing a Western novel 12 years before him, but writing a very similar Western novel 12 years before him. Can you kind of lay out Curtis's, quite briefly, like what is this book, The Administratrix? And maybe listeners who are familiar with The Virginian will clue into some of the similarities as you describe it.
The Administratrix is about a young woman who comes out west to be a school teacher, and that will sound familiar, I think, to a lot of the listeners. And she falls in love. She overcomes her prejudices to fall in love with a cowboy who she at first deems beneath her station. But she overcomes her prejudices, falls in love, and marries him. Whereas the Virginian ends with the marriage of Molly to the Virginian. In the Administratrix, the school teacher, she marries her cowboy, and they run a household together. She helps him run the ranch, he is there's a neighboring ranch that becomes jealous of him because he's so successful, and so he is set up. He is wrongly accused of cattle rustling, and he's lynched by a mob and killed. And so Mary goes into hiding and into mourning, and she emerges sometime later in disguise, and she calls herself disguised as a young cowboy, and she calls herself Mose. And so the cowboy Mose infiltrates the neighboring ranch where she suspects the murderers are working, in order to find her husband's murderers and get revenge.
Which she does.
Which she does, yes. I don't know. Do you want me to talk about the ending, or should we let people discover it?
Well, maybe we don't want them to spoil it, but it ends in quite fantastic fashion.
It does.
Blood and gore and some very Quentin Tarantino vibes. I wonder if he read this when he was writing his Kill Bill series, perhaps.
I don't know if it was, I don't know if anyone knew about it when Kill Bill came on.
Probably not. Um, so 12 years later, Owen Wister then writes The Virginian.
hmm
But again, he's not alone in his publishing. In the same year, you write about Frances McElrath,
Yes, yeah,
who writes a book called The Rustler,
yeah,
which takes as its backdrop the Johnson County War,
yeah,
just like The Virginian,
yeah,
um, offering even more thematic overlap.
yeah.
Um, how is her take, this kind of violent, cattle rustling, frontier vigilante violence scene, how does the Rustler, play out differently than Wister's The Virginian?
So as you know, in the Virginian, there's a very clear delineation between the good cowboy and the bad rustler. So the cowboy is loyal to the cattle owners, the big ranches, and the rustlers just want to make a quick buck. They don't have a work ethic, and so on. And so those lines are clearly delineated. I would say that McElrath's account is much closer to the history of the Johnson County War. That there was not that the myth of the cattle rustler, and this is something Christine Bold talks about in her book, The Frontier Club. The myth of the cattle rustler was something that the large cattle companies kind of fabricated in order to
It was a PR campaign,
yeah,
right?
as a PR campaign, and that they're so McElrath's account is much more sympathetic with the so-called cattle rustler. So she looks into his motives, things like kind of unfair wages and exploitative conditions, and various kind of unjust treatments of the cowboy. For example, I think if you got married, you could get fired. And rustlers were blamed. There was a particularly bad winter when there were huge losses of cattle, and these were blamed on so-called rustlers, but it was really the problem really resided in the unsustainability of the industry itself. And so McElrath's account is much more sympathetic with the so-called cattle rustler. Another thing she goes into, which is also you find in the history of the Johnson County War, is that the cowboys accused of rustling were the same ones who organized cowboys in kind of ad hoc unions in order to fight for their right to own their own cattle, for example. The cattle companies forbid their cowboys from owning their own cattle and kind of starting their own little herds. And so Frances McElrath takes on these details that are expunged from the Virginian, and Owen Wister himself would have known about these things as well. He knew people who were involved in the Johnson County War, but he kind of simplified details that kind of complicated the view of the dichotomy between the good cattle rancher, the honest cattle rancher, and the dishonest cattle thief.
So he's not talking about class conflict and labor strife and so forth like McElrath is, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, she then presents a female protagonist
Mm-hmm.
and kind of female-led reform. So if in the Rustler, class conflict is the source of violence, whereas in the Virginian it's this conflict between kind of between good and evil, good guys and bad guys, white hats and black hats, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So in the Rustler, class conflict is the source of violence, and she presents a very gendered solution in a way.
Yeah.
Can you want to describe that a little bit for us?
Yeah, so the Rustler also involves a romance between a kind of well-to-do female and a cowboy who is perceived to be beneath her station.
It's a familiar trope already.
Yes, yes. But in this case, and the female does, the heroine does reject the cowboy when he professes his love to her. And that's what makes him become ultimately triggers him to become a cattle rustler. He's already experienced a lot of, he comes from a broken home and he's experienced a lot of poverty in his life, but being rejected by this upper class woman really sends him over the edge. And so
It turns him to the life of crime.
Exactly. He turns to a life of crime. And so when she realizes what she's done after, a complicated series of events, she realizes her role in his decline, his moral decline, and decides that she's responsible. And so she becomes a reformer. This is the period of the woman reformer in American history. There are women's clubs and the settlement house movement and so on. And there's this view in society that women really do have the power and the responsibility of kind of healing a lot of the social divisions in the society. And so she becomes a Western woman reformer, and she goes to live among the cowboy rustlers. She starts a school for the rustlers' children,
yeah.
so that they can raise themselves up and have more opportunities than their parents did. So in the Virginian, you have the resolution through the violent confrontation between the Virginian and Trampas. And in the Rustler, you have the resolution of the conflict through the woman reformer who goes out and works among the disadvantaged people of the West.
Do you think that this not just female-centric reform plot, but just the kind of larger political message kind of in this progressive era, do you think that had something to do with it not having the impact that the Virginian did? No, I think sometimes, we have this famous example of Upton Sinclair in the jungle, and he lamented how he tried to hit us in the heart, with his story of socialism was really his point, and he accidentally hit us in the gut. And one time I had my students read the early unabridged drafts that he had intended to publish, and it is much longer on the politics. And the publisher said, no, that's not going to fly. And so I'm curious, do you think that the political message there had anything to do with Wister's the Virginian kind of being the one that's remembered, or the one that's really catches on?
It's so, I can only speculate on that. I honestly don't know. I honestly don't know.
Well, how are these two books, Curtis's 1889, The Administratrix, and McElrath's The Rustler in 1902, how do they sell? How are they received at the time?
Administratrix, as far as I can tell, it was published by a very small, obscure publisher. I don't know how much circulation it got. Probably it may even have been a vanity publication. I'm not sure. So it got limited circulation. The Rustler was fairly well reviewed. It got reviews in quite a lot of magazines and newspapers of the time. But neither of these books got the kind of publicity resources put into them that the Virginian did. So there's the larger kind of context in which male writers and women writers are working in, and male writers tend to be much more well-connected. They get a lot more resources thrown behind their work by publishers. And particularly when you're looking at the Westerns, because the women who are writing Westerns are living out in the West. And they don't have the kinds of social connections and the kind of habitus in terms of writing professionally that people like Wister and Zane Grey do. So that's one factor that we can look at and have the evidence to say, well, this is a factor that's going into why these books aren't circulating as much as comparable books by the male authors.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows? Maybe if The Wrestler did get the resources put behind it that The Virginian got, it might have been a bestseller too. I mean, there were kind of sentimental writers, women writers, who were making the bestseller list at this time, who were kind of pointing to social ills and so on. So I don't know.
Yeah, there's a readership for reform.
Yes.
Ideas at the time. Well, you get into this a little bit. Well, you spend a whole chapter about pseudonyms, and you have mine. I already forgot Lockhart's first name.
Carolyn.
Carolyn Lockhart, who writes under her own name, and she was pretty well known.
Mm-hmm.
But B.M. Bauer, who you already mentioned, largely did not. She wrote under this pseudonym, and it seems that her publisher, when she at one point tries to I think actually at multiple points, tries to make the case with her publisher that, some people have found out that I'm a woman, and I think this would actually help us sell better. There's interest in having these female-authored texts. And what does her publisher say?
Her publisher says that they're worried that her sales will suffer if it's discovered that B.M. Bauer is a woman. So they discouraged her from doing any publicity.
Which seems to perhaps reinforce your idea that, of kind of the gendered support that different authors receive in terms of publicity and resources behind their books and so forth, at least in the industry, even with a well-selling author. There was a fear that if her gender was revealed, it would hurt sales.
But I try to make a point of this in my book, is that Bauer is an exception to the other women I write about who did write in their own names. And so to a certain extent, the idea that that women writers of Westerns had to write behind pseudonyms is a bit of a myth. I think in Bauer's case, her publishers just wanted to control her, and not allowing her to do publicity was a way of controlling her. You see the same thing happening in the film industry at about the same time. The studios are really against any listing the names of the cast in their films, for example, because then they lose a lot of control to their actors. And I think that's the same thing happening in the case of B.M. Bauer. She was a kind of victim of her own success because she was making so much money for her publishers that if they let her do publicity, she might get scooped up by someone else who'd offer her more money. So that it was really a way of controlling her.
You talk about one more really interesting case study, that of Mourning Dove. And how do you pronounce the name of the book here? Kagewa?
Katsuya.
Okay.
Katsuya.
Written by not just a female author, but a Native woman.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit briefly about her story as well? Because this adds, again, another just fascinating wrinkle to this early history of female Western authors, and one that I was not anticipating when I picked up your book.
Yeah, Mourning Dove's novel Katsuya is pretty well known to scholars of Indigenous writing. but not so well known to perhaps scholars of the popular Western. But she lived on she lived near Seattle on the Colville Reservation, and she was a Salish speaker. She identified with the Okanagan tribe, and she was exposed to Westerns through a young white man who lived with her family for a time. He was a teenager, and she talks about him in her memoir. And he read what he called yellowback novels, and he would lend them to her, and that's how she learned to read, was through reading pulp fiction, and that's where she was exposed to Westerns. And she decided to write her own Western from an Indigenous point of view. And so that's where Kojuia or Katsuia came from. She had written a manuscript by 1914. And in 1914, she met an Anglo-American man from the area. And he kind of took up the cause of helping her to publish her novel. And part of helping her publish it was editing the novel to revise the language. He interjected political commentary into the novel. So they collaborated to write a Western, but a Western from an Indigenous perspective.
And again, this runs counter to so many kind of narratives that that I and others have inherited about not just Western literature but Indigenous literature. There were other literate natives that were writing at the time, but they were quite often ethnographers, authors who were presenting the histories of their people or recording oral traditions and so forth. And she definitely doesn't fit into that paradigm, does she?
No. A lot of other Native writing from the period was, or one of the opportunities to become writers that was more widely available to Indigenous people was that of the so-called Native informant.
Yeah.
So you would have anthropologists traveling among the reservations, recruiting educated Native people to tell the stories, share their folklore, share their traditions, because the widespread belief in Anglo-American society was that the tribes would be assimilated, and so their cultures needed to be preserved.
Yeah, this vanishing Indian idea.
Yes, yeah. And so that was the opportunity to become a writer that was most available at the time. But Mourning Dove didn't come at it that way. She came at it a much different way, through an encounter with this genre. And the Western, the popular Western, it's interesting because we identify it so much with Native genocide, but she also saw it as a way of telling a different story about herself and her people, instead of that kind of story of the dying civilization. She used the Western to tell a story about Indigenous resistance. And so in Katsuia, she tells the story of an encounter between a young mixed blood woman who lives on I think she sets it in the Flathead Reservation, not her own reservation, and her encounter with an Anglo-American who pretends to fall in love with her, but really he is after her allotment. This is the period of the
land, yeah.
division of reservations into individually owned allotments. And so he's after her allotment. And she eventually, at first she falls in love with him and she's in danger of being seduced by him. But she eventually, through actually reconnecting with the wisdom of her tribe, and reconnecting with other members of her tribe, she figures out what he's up to and is able to resist him.
So native tradition and ritual actually comes to save her in this book, or is kind of in a way her salvation, right?
And the other thing that the Western does for her that I found really interesting when I first read this book was, as Native informants, Indigenous writers sort of were pressured to depict themselves as kind of belonging to the past. And the Western gave Mourning Dove a way of representing her experience as part of the modern world. Because of that kind of trope of the encounter between the wilderness and civilization. So she saw that as an opportunity to tell a different story.
How was that book received at the time? I know that Indigenous literature scholars have recovered it and talked about it quite a bit. But
it's hard. It's hard to know because we just don't have access to. In a lot of cases, we just don't know who read it, what they thought about it. It was not widely reviewed. So I think it got her into trouble on her own reservation. I think a lot of people on her own reservation read it, and there was some objection to it. But no, it's really hard to know.
But she doesn't enter the kind of intelligentsia, the growing group of Native voices that are talking about Native issues in the teens and 20s and 30s, does she?
Yeah, she does. She remained an activist. She was involved in tribal politics. But she lived in very challenging conditions. She worked grueling manual labor jobs, harvesting crops and so on. She had health problems that are probably connected, to inadequate access to health care and difficult working conditions. So even despite these challenges, she did remain active in tribal politics. She kept writing. She wrote what was called at the time folklore, which was very popular. So she wrote a book of folklore called Coyote Stories.
So she does kind of then take on the more familiar Native informant role of writing ethnography and folklore and so forth.
And her collaborator, Lucillus McWhorter, kind of pushed her in that direction a little bit.
Was there more of a market for that?
There was, yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Interesting. Moving forward with your work, what do you hope that be it your scholarly community, the general public, or fans of Western literature, what do you hope that they're going to take away from your book?
Well, I really hope that we can put the old narrative to rest, and just start reading men and women writers side by side when we talk about popular Westerns. And I'm not the first scholar to point out, hey, there was a woman writing here. That's actually been going on for a long time. I mean, James Fenimore Cooper was writing in conversation with women. The dime novel was written in conversation with women writers. You have Anna Stevens writing Malaeska, the first dime novel. But yet that old narrative just stays so entrenched, and it just keeps on getting reiterated and reiterated. And I'm hoping that this work will encourage, teachers and students to, instead of seeing women as these aberrations or these exceptions, to see them as part of the tradition, part of the creation of, who participated in the making of the Western.
Yeah.
So that is my hope.
Well, one thing that I definitely took away is that not just that, there were also women authors, but how you explain how these female authors were also writing very different stories.
Right, yes.
And that their female characters were written quite differently as well, which is a point of analysis that may go largely overlooked if you had not opened this conversation up. So I know that in my own teaching, and hopefully in many others, this opens a new avenue for looking at kind of the traditional Western novel, but then asking ourselves, how does at times the gender of the author impact the type of story they're writing, the type of characters they're writing. And even as, it's so fascinating, even with this comparison with Wister, even when so many of the characters fall into the exact same just stock character roles.
Yes.
These female authors spun very different stories, which I just found fascinating.
Yes, yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a really good time.
Great. We look forward to seeing what new things you come up with in the future.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us on this podcast. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. I'm Brenden Rensink, and I serve here as the host, producer, and engineer, and pretty much everything else of the podcast. So if you have any praise or critique, I guess you can probably send it my way. I also serve here at the Redd Center as the assistant director and as an assistant professor in the Department of History. So please contact me if you have any questions, not just about the podcast, but about the Redd Center, our events, our funding, or anything else. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. You can find him at micahdalanderson.com. That's Micah, D-A-H-L, Anderson with an O.com. I'll go ahead and include a link in the episode description. If you live here in the Intermountain West, let me also mention our digital public history project, Intermountain Histories. You can visit it at intermountainhistories.org or download the free mobile app by searching for Intermountain Histories on your Apple or Android devices. With this website and free mobile app, you can explore and read carefully curated histories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. Each is researched and written by students and professors at universities around the region. Otherwise, please subscribe to the podcast or follow us on Facebook or Twitter to receive notification when the next episode goes live. We have many more fascinating conversations on the horizon and hope that you'll join us.